Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 91. More Disaster at Corycus. Antiochus III has just suffered a shattering defeat at Thermopylae, which has essentially closed Europe off to him. Let's see if the war in Asia will go any better. However, the title of this episode might give you an idea about how that's going to go. Now, we're not going to go into what the Romans did in Europe after Antiochus fled, but instead stick with the Seleucid side of the story. Antiochus III was apparently not that worried about the conflict, which is surprising given that Thermopylae had just happened. However, he assumed the Romans were not going to cross the Aegean into Asia. His allies at court told him this same thing, trying to flatter him or else just being plain wrong. The one dissenting voice was, as per usual, the Carthaginian general Hannibal. I get the feeling he's looking very dishevelled and stressed by this point. Hannibal was amazed the Romans were not, in fact, already in Asia. After all, it was a shorter distance from Greece into Europe than it was from Italy into Greece, where the Romans already were, so they had form for crossing similar bodies of water for invasions. Moreover, the Romans, once they arrived, were stronger on land than they were in the water. I guess his point here is that it would make sense for the Romans to try and fight a land battle by crossing the Aegean, as opposed to fighting a naval battle in the Aegean Sea. Hannibal besought Antiochus to forget his dreams of peace. The Romans wanted to conquer the world and would soon be in Asia. Antiochus needed to stop the Romans achieving their dreams of dominion, or else his empire would be lost to them. For once, Hannibal was listened to. Antiochus felt that Hannibal was the only one not just telling him what he wanted to hear. So, the king headed for the Chersonese with his fleet to strengthen his garrisons for when Rome showed up. Now, I'm not quite sure if I've interpreted correctly what the Chersonese refers to in Livy. Cherson was an old Greek colony on the Crimean Peninsula. If I've got this interpretation right, it seems surprising to me that the Romans would come through there, but still, I guess the idea is to have mastery of the Black Sea to prevent the Romans using it. That is, unless there is some other context of the word Chersonese which I'm missing. If so, please let me know at the show's email address. Antiochus also ordered the fleet prepared and scouting missions around the islands. In this case, I assume it refers to the islands of the Aegean Sea, given what's about to follow. Meantime, over on the Roman side, Gaius Livius set off from Rome with a fleet of 50 ships. He headed for Naples and then met his allies there. He then passed Sicily and got 6 ships from Carthage and some more allies as reinforcements. They then set out for Greece itself. Now, we get a bit of an overlap in terms of our timeframes here. Either Livius arrived before the Battle of Thermopylae, or else his news was outdated, as when he first showed up in Greece, he heard about Acilius and Antiochus drawing up in the mountain pass in the summer of 191 BCE. As we just said, he arrived in the summer as a general term, and the battle apparently took place in late April. So I guess what's happened here is that the news was late, but not by much. Based on his intelligence, Livius decided there was no rush, and went around the Peloponnese. He pillaged a few Aetolian cities, and then met Eumenes II of Pergamon at Piraeus. By the way, Piraeus is the harbour of Athens, in case we haven't mentioned it before. King Eumenes was uncertain what to do. By now, if not already, Antiochus was preparing his forces at Ephesus. So, Eumenes had the option of going back home to try and get Pergamon ready for war, given that Antiochus was getting his armies ready on Pergamon's doorstep. Alternatively, Eumenes could stick to the Romans whatever else happened, as his own survival was dependent on the Republic. So, Eumenes had essentially been dithering in Piraeus. Livius, meantime, was given 25 ships by his Roman predecessor, who sailed back for Rome itself. Livius then headed over to Delos with his fleet, including the 3 ships of Eumenes II, who was heading back to Pergamon. Given that we're headed east, I suppose in this case the goals of get back to Pergamon and cling to the Roman Republic kind of aligned. Now, by my estimate, Delos is about halfway through the Aegean Sea. Here, the Roman fleet was delayed a few days by the winds. It is also here that the scouts of Polyxenides found Livius anchored. When Antiochus III learned of this, he stopped what he was doing at the Hellespont and rushed back to Ephesus. I'm guessing, what with our emphasis on the Black Sea earlier, that his attention had been focused north on the Hellespont and the Black Sea region when it really should have been focused south. I'm guessing that if Antiochus didn't think the Romans were going to cross by sea, he might have thought they were going to cross through the Hellespont, but hey, that's just a guess based on the source material. Once back in Ephesus, Antiochus called a council to decide whether they should attack. Polyxenides was all for it, suggesting they not wait for Eumenes and Rhodes to reinforce the Roman fleet. Besides, he argued, the Seleucids knew that part of the sea well. This line of argument won the day, and 3 days later the Seleucid fleet set off for Delos. They had 100 ships, 70 of which were decked. By comparison, there were 81 decked vessels and many smaller craft in the Roman fleet. The Seleucid fleet may have set off, but Antiochus stayed behind, not wanting to be caught in a sea battle. He himself headed to Magnesia to summon his armies, while the fleet travelled to Erythrae to wait for the Romans. The Romans themselves set off once the winds calmed down. They stopped off for a while at the island of Chios, then travelled on. Polyxenides was thrilled at the Roman departure and caught the Romans at a location called Corycus. The battle that follows is either called the Battle of Corycus or instead the Battle of Chisos. Polyxenides sailed his ships towards the Roman fleet in a straight line. Livius spotted them and decided to wait for them. Eumenes and his ships had been in the back of the fleet, but when he saw the enemy, he rushed forwards and drew level with some Carthaginian vessels. 2 of the Seleucid ships then boarded a Carthaginian ship and captured it. The other Carthaginian ship nearby hid back in the Roman fleet, not wanting to suffer the same fate. Livius was furious at this defeat and sailed forwards with his flagship. The 2 now victorious Seleucid vessels sailed straight at him, wanting to replicate their earlier triumph. Once they drew alongside him, Livius ordered his oarsmen to lower the oars to draw alongside them, and his men boarded the Seleucid ships with hooks. This turned the naval battle into something of a land battle, and as we've just established, the Romans are better at land battles than naval engagements. By this point, there was fighting going on everywhere. As we established earlier, Eumenes showed up late to the party. He noticed that the Seleucid left was disorganised thanks to Livius' stunt, so he launched himself at the right flank where the fighting was equal. Before long, the Seleucid left was crumbling. Recognising which way the wind was blowing, pardon the pun, Polyxenides fled, and his fleet soon followed. Livius and Eumenes chased the Seleucid fleet down for as long as they could, but the lighter and faster Seleucid ships ended up getting away. That said, the Romans did capture 13 vessels and sunk 10. By contrast, the Romans themselves only lost that 1 Carthaginian ship right at the start. Once again, a defeat for the Seleucids. Polyxenides kept running until he arrived at Ephesus, while the Romans waited a day before continuing. Roughly halfway along their journey, they were reinforced by 25 ships from Rhodes, which is exactly what the Seleucids had tried to prevent. This combined fleet now drew in at Ephesus. That said, because of how soundly they had defeated the Seleucids and the acknowledgement of that defeat, Eumenes and the Rhodians were allowed to go home. The Romans themselves withdrew to Chios and ultimately wintered at Cannae and beached the ships. By the way, this is spelled Canae and is not the Battle of Cannae which Hannibal had won in 216 BCE. Let's wrap up the year 191 BCE. At the end of that year, Lucius Cornelius Scipio and Gaius Laelius became consuls with the aim of finishing the war. And incidentally, no, this is not that Scipio from the Second Punic War. That man was Scipio Africanus. Africanus had already been a consul in 205 BCE after taking Spain off the Carthaginians before invading Africa. This invasion had so frightened the Carthaginians they'd summoned Hannibal back from his Italian campaign, which is also the same campaign where the Battle of Cannae happened. Scipio Africanus had then demolished Hannibal's army on the 19th of October 202 BCE, near the town of Zama. He'd also ended the Second Punic War and forced terms on Carthage. As you can see, an impressive figure. However, this is not who we're talking about here as a consul in 190 BCE. Instead, we are discussing Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiaticus, the younger brother of Africanus. It is this man who was now one of the consuls to face Antiochus for the year 190 BCE. That said, the very impressive Scipio Africanus is still involved. This is because, in order to guarantee his brother's election to the consulship he himself had already held twice before, Africanus offered to serve under his younger brother as a legate. So, Africanus will be in our story. However, that will have to wait until next time. That brings us to the end of today's episode. As always, thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to get in touch at the show's email address. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.